and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be flipping through this book about the Persians, the masters of empire. It's from this book series called Lost Civilizations. Now, this book is really long. It's way too long for me to read to you the entire thing, so here's what we're going to do tonight. We are going to imagine a place full of ancient artifacts from the Persian Empire. A big museum. I'm going to read to you about all of the ancient artifacts that have been found across Iran, remnants of the Persian Empire. And as you imagine yourself walking through this museum, I'm going to read to you all the little signs in front of each artifact or photograph, and we're going to have big exhibits where I read to you the big long descriptions of a photograph series or a bunch of artifacts. So come along with me in our imaginary museum journey as we learn more about the Persian Empire. Here we have a map of what was the Persian Empire. You can see down here a bigger expanse of what it looked like. And here you see some pictures of some of the artifacts that we're going to talk about as we walk through our museum. Here we go. Here's our first item. It says, from a 2nd millennium BCE tomb at the Elamite city of Susa, this life-size clay head lay next to a skull and may have been a portrait of the dead man. The Elamites, fierce rivals of the Babylonians, were precursors of the royal Persians. Ashurbanipal's brutal campaign against Elam is triumphantly recorded in this relief from his Nineveh palace, showing the sack of an Elamite city in 647 BCE. Here, flames rise from buildings as Assyrian soldiers topple the city walls with pickaxes and crowbars and carry off the spoils. Their skill in close-quarter fighting enabled the Assyrians to easily overwhelm the Elamites, who are too dependent on bows and arrows for defense. It's a painting. French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan's excavations of the Susa Acropolis were in full swing when Georges Bondeau, a French artist traveling through Persia in 1905, made his sketches for this painting of the mound that held the remains of the city. The 15-foot-high work, showing some 20th century wear and tear, captures the pastoral timelessness of waiting herons, but reveals little of the archaeological drama unfolding in Susa's shadowed mound. The ancient and illustrious city lasted some 5,000 years under a succession of peoples: Elamites, Achaemenids, Seleucids, Parthians, and Muslims, before it was finally destroyed by the Mongols in the 13th century CE. Here's our first exhibit about the orphaned strays of Loristan. In the late 1920s, bronze horse trappings, weapons, votive objects, and ornaments began appearing on the international art market in growing numbers. They were being looted from the cemeteries of an apparently semi-nomadic horse-breeding people who flourished from the 1st millennium BCE in the upland valleys of the Zagros Mountains, a region known as Loristan. By the mid-1930s, archaeologists such as Erich Schmidt were flying reconnaissance flights over the isolated, rugged heart of Loristan in search of ruins and unopened graves. In 1938, a 9th century BCE temple site at Sorghum yielded hundreds of objects buried in the walls and floors, including the cache of bronze pins with stamped discs seen here. But since Schmidt's findings would remain unpublished for another 50 years, it would be the digging and studies of Belgian archaeologist Louis Vandenberge that at last provided a stylistic framework for identifying the thousands of orphaned strays lying in museums, private collections, and dealers' shops. Bronze experts like Oscar White Muscarella at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art have used Vandenberge's research to help authenticate Loristan pieces. He examined this 5.5-inch long pinhead, which bore a strong resemblance to a pin recovered at Surktum. He looked for simulated corrosion and patina, and for other telltale signs indicating that it might have been cast from an original. He then subjected it to metallographic analysis to determine if the piece was ancient or modern. The pinhead, happily enough, passed the tests. Here we have a photograph. Rifles at the ready, French writer and photographer Jane Dulafoy rests in the rough, open terrain around Susa in this 1886 photograph. During the 2 years she and her archaeologist husband, Marcel Auguste, spent excavating the palace of Darius, they were ever wary of marauding tribes. Many of Jane's photographs were later turned into engravings, such as this one, in which workers crate the Dulafoy's Achaemenid finds for transport to Paris. The couple's contributions greatly enriched the Louvre's Middle Eastern antiquities collection, which now numbers about 30,000 pieces. Another photograph. Ensconced in his tapestried study at Susa, Jacques de Morgan looks every bit the proper scholar. The photograph was taken inside the French archaeological delegation's headquarters, whose construction he oversaw in the 1890s. Assembled from recycled Elamite and Achaemenid remains, the fortress-like building, dubbed the Chateau, saved the archaeologists from the physical discomfort and anxiety experienced by the Dulafoys 15 years earlier. In the foreground of this picture runs a portion of Morgan's 300-foot-long Grand Trench, which cut a wide swath into Susa's Acropolis. In the background is the medieval-looking chateau. There we go. Now you can see. Almost a foot tall and capable of holding a gallon of liquid, the 6,000-year-old painted vase is considered a masterpiece of prehistoric Iranian pottery, renowned for being decorated with beautifully stylized animals. Thousands of pieces like this one are found by Morgan in the burials of the Acropolis Cemetery at Susa. Rendered at the site, his sketch shown here illustrates how such bowls and bakers were placed beside the dead. Almost said inside the dead. See how the pots were placed around the body. For almost 3,500 years, the roof of Tepti-Ahar's baked brick tomb lay intact. But in 1965, roadwork unwittingly destroyed part of the structure. The 11-inch tall clay head shown here, found in an artist's workshop strewn with shells, gold, sawed elephant bones, bronze tools, mosaic fragments, and bowls of dried pigments, may be a funerary portrait of the king. The head had been modeled, painted, polished, and inlaid, and a hole had been drilled in the base, probably for mounting. It's a gruesome photograph. Skeletons form a neat line in a crudely built sepulchre adjacent to the tomb of Tepti-Ahar. The Iranian archaeologist Izzat Negaban believes that they represent 14 members of the monarch's eternal guard, perhaps servants and wives sacrificed upon his death. Here the bodies were arranged in a row with faces to the north. Another 9 skeletons lay helter-skelter atop the victims' leg bones. Unlike the king's tomb, which contained an additional 21 human sacrifices, this burial chamber had no door. Once the bodies were placed inside, a rough barrier of baked bricks were put up to seal them in. For centuries, the Ziggurat of King Ntashna was known by the locals as Chogazambil, or basket mound, because it resembled an upside-down basket. Once excavation began on the 250-acre complex, hundreds of inscriptions proclaiming the king's name began coming to light. Also uncovered were hand-tooled white and opaque blue or black glass rods that, set diagonally into panels, decorated the ziggurat's wooden doors. Though no longer the capital of Elam, the city thrived until Ashurbanipal's savage attack left it in ruins. Found in 1903 in the temple of Ninhursag at Susa, this 14th century BCE statue of Queen Naparasu is a high point of Elamite metalwork. Naparasu's dress and even her fingernails have been carefully modeled. Using the lost wax process, a copper shell was cast over a bronze core and then probably covered with gold foil. The figure weighs 3,760 pounds. Measuring almost 2 feet in length, this bronze tableau lay embedded in the wall of an Elamite tomb, 3 feet below the temple where the statue of Queen Naparasu was found. A 12th century inscription of an Elamite king identifies the scene as a sun ritual, the only three-dimensional example of worship in progress in the ancient Middle East. Here, 2 priests with shaved heads kneel, surrounded by miniature ziggurats, conical pillars, jars, basins, altars, and trees. Similar structures and basins were uncovered on the southeast or sunrise side of the ceremonial forecourt of Chogazambil. Here we have our first big exhibit about preservation, save what remains or show what once was. At the root of every archaeologist's search lies a passion to know what the found object looked like when new. This desire has often been keen enough to fuel efforts not only to preserve artifacts, but to return them to their original appearance. The trio of terracotta panels shown here, which are 12th century BCE decorations from the walls surrounding the temple of Ishushinakatsusa, are examples. Each consists of 14 stacked bricks. Before putting the panels on display in 1930, restorers filled in chips, substituted plaster copies for missing bricks, and carefully painted each new piece, all in the hope of recapturing the impression the work made on viewers more than 3,000 years ago. The panels constitute only a fraction of a collection of bricks from the wall taken to Paris after their discovery in Persia between 1912 and 1924. Most were placed untouched in storage where they sat for 6 decades. During that time, the role of the art restorer changed dramatically. Humbled by the knowledge that future archaeological discoveries and technological advances might render the most enlightened of reconstructions obsolete, conservators today try to show the object as it really is. So in 1990, it was decided to reassemble 3 additional panels from the temple wall. The goal was not to improve them, but simply to show what remained of them. When we found fissures, the project director, Brigitte Bourgeois, explained, explained flaws that were due to the manufacturing techniques of the ancients, their way of drying or baking the bricks, the way of mixing clay with chopped grass. Then we left them as such. The result of conservators' effort is seen here. So let's read about these 3 panels of bricks. After more than 6 decades, the figures in this 1928 restoration of panels from the temple of Inshushinak at Susa, a pole man, a palm tree, and a goddess, appear almost new. Because the excavators were not able to locate the top of 2 bricks of the goddess and her face was badly damaged, the restorers reworked her features and gave her a new headdress made of plaster. Conservators use a microscope to identify minerals, traces of mortar, bitumen decoration, and other deposits on bricks that had been stored for more than 60 years. Such close examination also revealed the fingerprints of the artisans who first molded the bricks 3,000 years ago. Here's a photograph. A sculptor fashions a new headdress for the goddess, shown here. Even after firing, the clay would have been easy to tell from the old. Yet in 1990, shown here, conservators of the similar second work, unlike their 1928 counterparts, chose not to replace the missing part. To accommodate future transport, as well as expected revisions and discoveries, the bricks in the 1991 restoration were not fused permanently, but mounted on a metal frame. Conservators strengthened flaking bricks with synthetic resins that are easily soluble, and they did not rework or paint the blocks. Which do you think is better, to fix what was or show how it is? It's a little debatable, isn't it? But I think it's best not to tamper with artifacts. Let's look at these. In 1904, French archaeologist Roland de Mequinim discovered a 12th century BCE cache of votive objects deposited in the sacred area of Zeus's Acropolis. Among the objects were these two gold and silver figurines mounted on lumps of copper. Standing 3 inches high, they are almost identical representations of an Elamite king at worship. One hand is held forward in offering, while the other holds a goat, probably intended for sacrifice. Another treasure from the cache is the 4.5-inch long lapis lazuli dove studded with gold pegs. It's just missing his little beak. Get this photograph. In an excavation tent at Tepe Marlik in 1962, Izzat Negaban surveys a few of the pots, figurines, and gold bowls found in 53 lavish and elaborate burials dating back more than 3,000 years. Camouflaged by lush vegetation, the cemetery remained untouched until the archaeologist and his team stumbled on it. They were conducting an archaeological survey of the region, deemed necessary because of the extensive illegal digging that was going on. Also found in many of the graves at Tepe Marlik were these brightly stylized terracotta bull vessels. They were molded after the herds of humpbacked cattle that still graze in the region today. The heads serve as pouring spouts. Wow. Fanned by her attendant, an elegantly coiffed Elamite woman sits cross-legged on a lion-footed stool, winding thread on a spindle, while a meal of fish awaits on the table. This 5-inch fragment of an 8th century BCE relief was molded and carved from a mix of bitumen, ground calcite, and quartz. The Elamites also used bitumen, a naturally occurring mineral pitch, or asphalt for vessels, sculpture, glue, caulking, and waterproofing. Oh, here's an exhibit. Joy and Dread at Hyacinths. Go. Can't get the whole thing in one shot. That's the best I can do. In an accepted feature of archaeology, that little, if any, of the emotion felt in the field ever makes its way into the final report. Yet to judge from the experiences of American and Iranian excavators at Hasanlu, an 80-foot-high mound near Lake Urmia in northwestern Iran, digging at the site can evoke a wide range of feelings. The archaeologists started work in 1957 under the direction of the University of Pennsylvania archaeologist Robert H. Dyson Jr. They soon came across what he called the discovery of a lifetime. Under a layer of charred debris in the ruins of one of the 5 monumental buildings on the site, a worker found human bones. As Dyson and his assistants brushed away the dirt, a glint of metal caught their eye. Thinking it was a bracelet, Dyson recalled, I brushed some more. Our eyes got bigger and bigger as the sliver became a strip, and then a sheet, and then a golden bowl. Spirits were so high after the 1958 discovery that Dyson raised the crumpled vessel overhead in triumph. Then he and his team washed the bowl, filled it with wine, and drank a toast to their good fortune. Further digging revealed weapons and silver, gold, and ivory artifacts, indications that the fire that consumed Hasanlu spread too quickly for the attackers to loot it. But the spade work also brought to light evidence of a disaster. 246 skeletons of men, women, children, and infants, more than half of whom had apparently been crushed under collapsing walls and roofs. Excavators found the remaining bodies in open areas. Possessing gruesome head wounds or severed limbs, they apparently had been victims of a bloody slaughter. Not a few archaeologists who excavated at the site, Sculler wrote, were emotionally affected by the carnage and the human suffering that had taken place. The skeleton of a man, one of hundreds found at Hasanlu, lies face down where he fell in a battle fought about 800 BCE. The broken sword on his right identifies him as a warrior, but experts cannot say if he was a defender or an attacker. And here you can see the gold cup was so prized that at least 3 people in ancient Hasanlu died protecting or stealing it. The scene shows a storm engulfing a bull spewing water onto the land, and a boxer fighting a monster. Now this is a really interesting exhibit, the flight paths to discovery. These really interesting photographs that we're going to look at. In 1935, Mary Helen Schmidt, a wealthy American, gave a gift to her German-born husband, archaeologist Erich F. Schmidt, director of 3 Iranian expeditions. It was a Waco biplane equipped with a 220 horsepower engine. Dubbed Friend of Iran, the craft was soon crisscrossing the country as it would until 1938. Although a few sites in other nations had been photographed from the air, Schmidt's plane would lead, as Mrs. Schmidt had hoped, to the first large-scale, carefully planned aerial survey of ancient ruins. The regions under Schmidt's direction, Persepolis in the south, Ray near Tehran in the north, and Loristan in the Zagros Mountains, ranked at the top of his aerial agenda. He made hundreds of dazzling panoramic overviews with his camera, like the shot shown here of Qasr-i Abu, a 7th century CE Sasanian citadel in southern Iran. Such images helped pinpoint areas for exploration. Commuting time was saved by flying between 3 areas, and en route, Schmidt and his colleagues learned, in his words, to see faster. Overhead photography was a challenge. Shooting through a hole in the bottom of the plane proved inadequate until a suspension mechanism was attached. It held the camera and a telescope that showed the landscape in crisp detail. Thanks to built-in leveling devices, both adjusted to a horizontal position that allowed the photographer to get the picture he wanted. While vertical views were essential for mapping, oblique photos proved more useful for assessing the relative heights of buildings, columns, and walls. The team also found that the spring and the moments after sunrise offered the best opportunities. The features of the terrain were more sharply defined than that at other times. Most important, the team was able to chart unknown territory for future excavation. It took a mere 13 hours of flying to cover more than 400 ancient sites on the plain of Persepolis, a task that, Schmidt figured, would have taken years on the ground. So let's look at some of his photographs. Overhead photographs of Persepolis, such as this one, reveal the city's layout. The lower left quadrant shows Schmidt's 1935 to 1936 excavation of Darius I's capital. Fortifying walls enclosed the crumbs, as Schmidt put it, of magnificent palaces set aflame by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE. Columns and ramparts, shot in early morning light, cast long shadows that indicate their relative heights. The largest square-like structure is the huge Apadana, or audience hall. The smaller one behind it is the Hall of 100 Columns, and the long rectangular roofed building to the side is Dig headquarters. The rows of ringed dots on the right, you can see down here, are wells of contemporary irrigation systems. Similar vertical shoots of other archaeological sites made direct mapping of them by Schmidt and team quick, easy, and accurate. Sorry, I kept losing my place while I was looking at the picture. Look at this. There we go. Shot from an oblique angle at about 300 feet, this imposing outcrop, called Ntashna, near Persepolis, stands against the backdrop of Istoker Mountain. Cruciform or cross-like facades mark the entrances to the rock tombs of Darius II, Artaxerxes I, Darius I, and hidden in shadow Xerxes I. 2, 3, 4, I think. The as yet unexcavated cube was raised by Darius I. It may have been a Zoroastrian fire tower. This holy area, situated on a swell of land in front of the cliffs, was investigated by Schmidt's predecessor Ernest Herzfeld, who cut exploratory trenches along its edge. Schmidt excavated the smaller rise at the entry of Darius's tomb, where he found an assortment of Sasanian silver coins and seals. This cool photograph. The aesthetic potential of the oblique shot is realized in a dramatic view of the mountain of Bebistu, known to the ancients as Bogostana, or place of God. Into the majestic face, more than 300 feet above ground level, Darius I ordered a relief carved in 520 BCE, memorializing how he had preserved the Persian Empire by his triumph over 9 rebel kings. I don't think you can really see it in this, but we'll see it in later pictures. Running along the base of the mountain was the Royal Road, which extended some 1,600 miles, spaced at 18-mile intervals, the equivalent of a day's walk, were inns for the convenience of foot-weary travelers. To see it all. So pretty. Early on the morning of July 27th, 1937, Schmidt and his flight crew, which always included his wife, circled the oval forest of Tashti Suleiman, or the Throne of Solomon, snapping a photo whenever the sun pierced the cloud cover. Set on a natural rise amid a mosaic of cultivated fields 250 miles west of Tehran, the citadel was occupied from the Parthian to the Mongol era, a span of some 1,300 years. Each Sasanian ruler, according to legend, journeyed there to humble himself at the sacred altar of the fire god before ascending the throne. The remains of the altar lie at the center of a group of rectangular buildings, to the left of the deep lake. Right here. The uneven surface of the citadel is made up of the ruins of many small dwellings believed to have housed soldiers and priests. A gold plaque of the 5th or 4th century BCE shows a man in Median dress carrying a bundle of sticks, perhaps for use in a ritual. Before being conquered by the Persians, the Medes were the ruling force, with a sphere of influence that may have extended from eastern Turkey to northern Afghanistan. Oh, this is a famous site. Constructed out of large blocks of stone, the austere tomb of the Persian king Cyrus the Great rears more than 35 feet high on the windswept Murghab plain. Cultural influence is evident in the architecture of the monument, from Mesopotamian stepped ziggurats to Anatolian tombs, suggest that Cyrus was eager to adopt ideas from the variety of peoples who inhabited his vast empire. Let's learn about a dynamic melding of art styles. The mingling of peoples and cultures that helped shape the history of the ancient Middle East often had fertile effect on its art as well. A melding of styles, this gold pectoral, which dates between the 8th and 7th centuries BCE and is more than 1 foot across, was apparently among treasures buried for safekeeping in a bronze tub at Zawiya, site of a ruined fortress in northwest Iran. No one knows whether this hoard of gold, silver, and ivory, found in 1947 by a shepherd boy and dispersed before it could be properly studied, was hidden by a defender of the fortress or by a plunderer who intended to come back for it. Nor can anyone say whether the fortress was built by the Assyrians or by their rivals, the Minians. But the execution and iconography of the pictorial suggests that its maker had eclectic taste, and that the fortress's inhabitants were more cosmopolitan than might have been imagined. The piece is divided into 2 bands with ribbon-like trees of Eurasian design at its center. In each of the upper corners crouches a beast that indicates the influence of the Scythians, nomadic horsemen who may have been responsible for the fort's destruction. In both panels, various winged beasts echo the art of lands as far-flung as Assyria, Syria, Phoenicia, and perhaps Greece. Very interesting. Look at this photograph. Built some 100 feet above the ancient riverbed, this 2,700-year-old fortification at Göbekli was used by the Medes, perhaps under governance of a local Khan or prince during the 7th century BCE. For reasons unknown, the site was abandoned in the next century and was then taken over by squatters. Although the Medes at Göbekli originally seemed concerned with defense, improving the fortress here with ramparts and arsenals, they eventually ceased to maintain it. Arrow slots like the one shown here, with an archaeologist's measuring rod, filled up with debris and were even plastered over. The chamber above at Tepe-Babacan in eastern Loristan reflects a rare usage of bright color in early 1st millennium local architecture. More than 170 painted clay tiles, decorated with geometric patterns, were discovered lying on the floor of the chamber, where they may have ended up after falling from the ceiling when a fire ravaged the site. I keep looking at the pictures and losing my place. They're so neat. The remains of a Median site known as Tepe-Nushijan sprawl atop a shale outcrop that rises 121 feet above the Jaukar Plain in northern Iran, 37 miles south of the as yet unexcavated Median capital of Ekbatana at Hamadan. Archaeologists have uncovered several structures at Nushijan, including a fort and 2 temples built by the Medes around 750 BCE. The buildings were deserted in the 6th century BCE, and as at Göbekli, the site was occupied by squatters. Excavations in 1970 at Nushijan by British archaeologist David Stronach revealed a temple with a fire altar at the bottom of this 8th century BCE tower, which had been carefully filled with shale and then abandoned. The use of fire here, apparently during rites, may foreshadow its broader application into the Zoroastrian religion, which was to gain large numbers of Persian adherents in the next centuries. A hoard of silver lies exposed to daylight some 2,000 years after being packed into a bronze bowl and buried under the floor in a fort at Tepe-Nushijan. The spirals dating to the 3rd millennium BCE were among more than 100 items in the bowl. The pieces may have been meant for use as a means of payment in commercial transactions. Discovered in western Turkey, these magnificent silver bowls and pitchers from the mid-6th century BCE led credence to the saying, rich as Croesus. About this time, Cyrus the Great focused his ambition on the west, defeating the wealthy Lydian king in Sardis and looting Croesus's treasuries. The Persians used the precious objects to finance military campaigns. The only intact large-scale relief at Pasargadae, this figure wearing an Elamite robe, once guarded the gateway to Cyrus's palace. Aspects of the sculpture suggest the cultural influences at work in the king's vast empire. The crown, composed partly of the curving ram's horns and upright cobras, seems to have been based on a Syrian or Phoenician model, which apparently had been derived from an Egyptian prototype. The figure's wings hark back and turn to Assyrian and Babylonian sculptures. Right down here, the sketch. Two of the four porticos that gave entry to Cyrus's audience hall at Pasargadae are seen in this reconstruction by architect Friedrich Krefter. Within the building lay a chamber 107 by 72 feet. Bless you. By 72 feet, with stone columns 2 stories high. Only one still stands, the nesting place of a stork. Let's see. Cyrus's throne, made of blocks of black stone, can be seen here. Left of the 2 partial columns above in the ruins of the grand hall of his residence, Palace P at Pasargadae. An enigmatic tower structure, the Sendan, rises behind it, and beyond looms Throne Hill. A big exhibit from the Royal Persians' Earthly Visions of Paradise. Here we go. The Persians gave the world the word paradise. To them, paradise was a paradisus, or enclosure, a walled park or garden. In their arid land, a well-watered green space filled with trees and shrubs was to be savored and enjoyed. Not surprisingly, Persian kings had gardens created for their pleasure. According to Xenophon, Cyrus the Younger led the Spartan general Lysander through his garden at Sardis. Laid out with geometric precision, it consisted of arrow-straight paths and beds, everything exact and arranged in right angles, and over all hung the intoxicating scent of flowers. Impressed, Lysander praised the architect, ignorant that Cyrus was responsible. Here comes my cat. Hi, kitty. Thanks for the kisses. Okay. It's my bath time, apparently. Sorry for the interruption. Can you even see? There's just a big cat in the way. Oops. Okay, kitty, come here. Thank you. Oh, you're gonna purr for us too. Come on. Okay, let me keep reading. Impressed. Yeah, I read that part. The pleased prince let on that he had designed the garden and had even planted part of it. Cyrus's love for gardens may be traced back to Cyrus the Great, who had a new capital built at Pasargadae. There a throne was placed on Palace P's portico, so he could gaze down a large inner garden divided into quadrants, perhaps intended to reflect the empire's 4 quarters. But Cyrus did not live to see the project completed. Killed in battle, he came to be buried in a nearby tomb, surrounded by another garden. So, Cyrus the Great's 2 palaces at Pasargadae, designated by archaeologists as P and S, stood in gardens, as the ground plan above shows. Trying to get around the cat. Broad pathways facilitated strolling, while 2 airy pavilions encouraged contemplative viewing. Water running in channels beside the paths kept the main garden moist, and also added a glittering fluid element. At right is one of the basins of well-cut stone through which the water flowed. Persian love of plants and trees is manifest in the details shown here, taken from a staircase found at Persepolis. The vegetation is brightly stylized, making identification difficult. And this huge, beautiful rock. In the centuries that followed the demise of the Persian Empire, the passion for gardens continued unchecked, as the scene above from a 1341 CE illuminated manuscript and the 18th century carpet illustrate. The weaver divided his garden into squares, perhaps an echo of the ground plan of Cyrus the Great's 4-sectioned inner garden at Pasargadae. From the air, the ruined walls of Talitakt, or Throne Hill at Pasargadae, seem so grandly conceived that David Stronach suggested they belonged to an unfinished palace for Cyrus, not a fortress, as some scholars had thought. Close up, shown here, the masonry displays a fine hand. Mason marks identifying individual work groups are visible on the middle block. Others are reproduced here in gold. The holes were gouged by scavengers seeking the iron clamps that join the stones. A humble Achaemenid water jar holds a treasure uncovered by archaeologists excavating a garden pavilion at Pasargadae. Inside, 1,162 objects had been stashed. Among them a subsequently reconstructed necklace of pearls with a dangling gold bell. The finely wrought gold mesh earring, one of a pair in the cache, sports an oval piece of wire encased lapis lazuli. In design, it is similar to Etruscan earrings from the 4th century BCE. This 2-foot-tall, 2,500-year-old green basalt statue, the head is a modern restoration, of Egyptian dignitary Uja-Horesni, bears hieroglyphic inscriptions extolling his support of Persia's king Cambyses, conqueror of Egypt. By bestowing on Cambyses the title of son of Ra, Uja-Horesni established a divine Egyptian lineage for the foreigner. After Uja-Horesni's death, a cult devoted to him sprang up. Interesting. Here we go. Going to the edge for Darius. Here's that carving I was telling you about. Now do you believe what I have done? Darius I's words seemed almost to taunt American historian and linguist George C. Cameron as he risked life and limb in 1948 to study firsthand the king's inscriptions chiseled into a cliff 340 feet above Iran's rocky Behistun plain. Cameron's goal was to copy and photograph them, transcribe 4 columns of hitherto inaccessible text, make latex molds, like those seen partially covering up the 10 by 18-foot central panel here, and figure out how the sculptors had reached the wall 2,500 years ago. There, the Persians completed one of the greatest self-advertisements of all time, which proclaimed in 3 tongues Darius's triumph over his 10 enemies. An oil company operating close by helped by drilling holes into the cliff 200 feet above the panels and inserting steel pins. These allowed Cameron to suspend cables for a scaffold. Still, to get to the platform, he and his 2 assistants had to climb down part of the rock face and then descend a 30-foot ladder. Outcrops made raising and lowering the scaffold difficult. In his explorations, Cameron discovered that the ancient sculptors had reached their perches by steps they chiseled away when the work was finished. As the days wore on, Cameron and his men were assaulted by cold and rain. To keep warm, he wore 2 pairs of pants, a wool shirt and sweater, an army coat, a sheepskin jacket, and a blanket. Creating the mold involved applying 5 layers of latex, to which burlap and gauze were added for body. Sometimes Cameron had to lean from the ends of the scaffold, which had no guardrails. Once he nearly fell, pulled back in the nick of time by his 12-year-old son, Tom. "Dad," teased the boy, "if you fall, I'll never speak to you again." Suspended from steel cables and guided by ropes, the scaffold is lowered into position in front of the panels. Water seeping from the limestone mountain had eroded some of the inscriptions but preserved others by coating them with sediment. By removing the crust with gentle taps of his hammer, Cameron revealed new writings. Here you can see Cameron's son Tom measures one of the narrow ledges on which the carver stood. His father was working on just such a ledge when a loosened boulder came crashing down, showering the scholar, who had thrown himself against the wall, with fragments. Persepolis, a ghostly grandeur. So vast were the riches assembled and displayed at Persepolis, it was written that its conqueror, Alexander the Great, required 10,000 pairs of mules and 5,000 camels to carry everything away. What could not be removed, the Greek biographer Plutarch relates, was put to the torch. Columns, capitals, joists, and beams exquisitely fashioned from Lebanese cedar went up in flames, along with any furniture, tapestries, and other combustibles that Alexander's plundering troops may have left behind. Wood roofs crushed to the ground in showers of ash and ember, and soon only these columns, doorways, reliefs, and sculptures had been hewed from stone remained standing, and many of these toppled later in earthquakes. Experts suspect that most of the mud brick walls also survived the conflagration, but centuries of scouring summer sandstorms were to reduce them gradually to dust. Accumulating at the site, wind-blown dust and sand covered ashes and ruins alike, burying them beneath a layer as much as 26 feet deep and sparing them from the ravages of time and marauder. The ashes, finally uncovered after 1931 by excavators from the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, under the direction of the pioneering archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld, and later that of Eric F. Schmidt, would corroborate Plutarch's account of the blaze, and much of the sculpture would be so well preserved that the Institute's executive secretary could describe it in 1933 as clean, sharp, and fresh-looking as though chiseled yesterday. However battered they may be around the edges, the pair of stairway reliefs pictured here are good examples, together with carvings discovered on the door jambs of Darius I's palace, visible up here, and his Apadana or audience hall, whose columns are right here. They would almost double the world's existing collection of ancient Persian art. A past awaiting discovery. When Ernst Herzfeld climbed the Mountain of Mercy to take the snapshots joined together down here. All of these. He could hardly have dreamed of the riches that awaited Persepolis' excavators. Thick walls pointed to fortifications, doorways and windows delineated once opulent chambers, and the columns evoked halls with lofty ceilings. Years of back-breaking digging, however, would be required to bear such finds as 20,000 cuneiform tablets, or the grand stairways of the Apadana and Council Hall. Where the staircase friezes poked above ground, they have been damaged. Below ground, they were almost pristine shape. The sculpted head belonged to one of a pair of immense stone bulls that guarded the portico at the north end of the Hall of 100 Columns. Identical images of a king, probably Xerxes I, top two door jambs at the south end of the rubble-strewn Hall of 100 Columns. So let's look at this big picture. So at this part, the Palace of Xerxes I, the Palace of Darius I, Council Hall, the Hall of 100 Columns, the Apadana, the Gate of Xerxes, finished gate, and the northern fortifications. And that's Persepolis. Removing the dust of time. Hundreds of villagers were recruited to do the spade work and sifting that the project required, and a few were trained to act as foremen, summoned at sunrise by a makeshift gong, a steel blade suspended from a wood post and struck with a mallet. The workers began each day with a song and labored until sunset, taking off half an hour for a lunch of bread, cheese, water, and goat's milk or yogurt. Here, dust rises from the Mountain of Mercy as diggers expose the eastern fortifications. Carts were used to haul earth to a dump site. Here you can see workers in covered chambers lying between the Hall of 100 Columns on the right and the already cleared North Hall of the Treasury. Earthquakes scattered many of the Apadana's reliefs and other carved stone pieces. Using rope, wooden planks, and muscle power, workers dragged the heavy chunks up the northern stairway. Here you can see a large tripod is employed to set fallen reliefs from the eastern stairway in place. Setting up shop in a harem. After sleeping in tents for 2 seasons, Herzfeld and his team finally found comfortable accommodations in 1933 at the edifice shown here, now then known as the Harem of Xerxes I, which the architect Friedrich Krefter turned into the expedition's workrooms and living quarters. Herzfeld's 2 dogs had the run of the place, as did Krefter's Airedale. And at night, after the sounds of the workday had died away, Herzfeld, Krefter, another architect, and a draftsman gathered in a rug-shaped chamber, took up violins, a viola, and a cello, and let the music of a string quartet mingle with the clanking bells of passing camel caravans. Here, carved stone windows and doorways were with fluted lintels ring 8-column bases in the north portico of the harem. Oriental Institute builders recreated the deteriorated walls and placed new columns and capitals atop the bases as part of the restoration of the building. This picture. Workers sort shreds in the rebuilt harem. Since pieces of stone columns were not found in this area of the site, architects concluded that the originals had to have been made of wood. Buildings that rose from the ashes. Almost 30 years after Friedrich Krefter departed from Persepolis in 1935, the ancient capital again seized the architect's imagination. Drawing on his experiences with Herzfeld and on the results both of Herzfeld's successor Erich Schmidt and of subsequent Iranian and Italian excavators, Krefter penned a series of detailed and sweeping reconstructions that transformed such desolate tableau as one shown here into scenes of kingly grandeur. 3 of the renderings are reprinted here. So, photographed from the north at the start of excavations, some of the Apadana's 13 surviving columns dwarf the archaeologist's tents. Wow. In Friedrich Krefter's reconstruction, shown here, troops muster on the plain to the west of Persepolis. The double stairway at the head of the formation leads to the Gate of Xerxes, through which all visitors were obliged to pass to reach the Apadana, a large square building at the center of the illustration. Topped with bulls' heads, 60-foot-tall columns brace the beamed ceiling of the Apadana's west portico, depicted by Krefter from within its central hall. Here, Krefter's drawing features monumental curved stairways leading to the Apadana's east portico and the main entrance of the council hall. Its full extent revealed by decades of digging and restoration, Persepolis still projects might and grandeur in this photograph made in the 1970s. An Italian team labored to conserve and stabilize many of the surviving structures on the rectangular foundation that underlay the city. Enthroned in Persepolis, the magnificent city he built, Darius I firmly grasps the royal scepter in his right hand. In his left he holds a lotus blossom with 2 buds, symbolic of royalty. I keep losing my place because I'm staring at the pictures. In this photograph, taken in 1939, Iranian crews directed by members of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute excavate a limestone tower constructed by Darius I at Loristan, 4 miles north of Persepolis. Although scholars are still unsure of its purpose, the tower may have been erected as a tomb or used in religious rituals. The building, more than 40 feet tall, contains 1 room approached by a stairway. In a watercolor painted in 1913 by French architect and archaeologist Maurice Pillet, Darius I leads a procession of servants and guards into a chamber of his stone-columned palace at Susa. Born in 1881, Pillet traveled in the Middle East and worked for the French expedition at Susa. He included the glazed brick frieze of archers after seeing it reconstructed here in Paris. There you go. Discovered by the French expedition in the 1880s, the colorful but fragile bricks making up the frieze shown here were found scattered near the entrance to the palace. Jane Dulafoy wrote of her concern regarding their excavation and shipment to the Louvre. What terrible worries I have about the discovery and removal of the enamels. When moved, they break and crumble. The 3 by 13-inch bricks made of sand and lime, then enameled in brilliant hues, were strengthened during reconstruction. Some scholars have identified the archers as members of the 10,000 Immortals, the elite Persian Guard. A Persian soldier raises his wicker shield as a Greek hoplite attacks him in a scene in a 5th century BCE red-figured Greek vessel. The ever-widening boundaries of the Persian Empire under Darius I were maintained by a loyal and fierce army. In addition to the standing army, Persian kings used their vast wealth to hire mercenaries, among them Greeks. Look at this. Can't even get the whole thing in the shot. 2 snarling lions, an ancient Mesopotamian motif borrowed by the Persians, adorn the hilt of this 17-inch long gold dagger. Although usually considered too soft to be used in weapons, the metal employed here had been strengthened by ridges along the blade, suggesting that the sword may not have been intended exclusively for ceremonial use. A massive doorway crowned with the concave cornice typical of those in the palace of Darius I at Persepolis still stands at the site of the Persian temple of Thebes in the Egyptian oases of El Karga. Cambyses II, who ruled Egypt before Darius, caused widespread resentment when he attempted to diminish the importance of the country's millennia-old religion. Darius took a more conciliatory approach, building temples such as this one, whose reliefs cast Darius in the role of the pharaoh. Made of gray-blue limestone and most likely sculpted in Egypt around 510 BCE, this headless statue of Darius I was discovered in Susa in 1972. Its robe and pedestal bear inscriptions in Egyptian, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all naming the king. Probably brought to Susa by Darius' son Xerxes I during a period of Egyptian rebellion, the statue was placed near the gateway leading into Darius' palace. Oh wow. Look at this. Median dignitaries carry tribute to the king as they ascend the northern stairway of the council hall at Persepolis. The sculptor conveys a sense of stately movement as the figures climb in lockstep. Some of the officials, in a gesture of respect, hold one hand in front of the mouth. Let's see if I can find one. Like this one. And this one. Look at this. A servant in the palace of Darius I at Persepolis stands ready, with towel and perfume bottle, to minister to the needs of his sovereign. The vast wealth accumulated by the Achaemenid kings afforded a lifestyle of extraordinary luxury that was supported by thousands of slaves. The magnificence of Persian court life is illustrated by the exquisitely crafted gold Rhyton below. So huge were the Persians' stores of gold that the precious metal was even carried to the battlefield, where the court assembled and continued to live royally. According to Herodotus, the booty collected by the Greek general Pausanias after the defeat of Xerxes' army included gold and silver furniture, couches overlaid with the same precious metals, bowls, goblets, and cups, all of gold. Morning light casts long shadows across Persepolis. In the background can be seen the tent city erected by Shah Reza Pahlavi to house dignitaries invited to the 1971 celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire. German architect Friedrich Krefter of the Oriental Institute holds up one of the metal foundation tablets of the Apadana, the audience hall at Persepolis that he unearthed in 1933. Discovered in the northeast and southeast corners of the main portion of the structure, the tablets were encased in 2 limestone boxes. Each box contained 2 13-inch square tablets, 1 gold and 1 silver. Inscribed alike in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, the plaques identified Darius I as the builder of the Apadana. four Achaemenid kings, Xerxes I, Darius I and II, and Artaxerxes I, had their tombs cut into the cliff face at Nashkiristan. Only Darius I, seen here in the photo, is identified by inscriptions. Tombs thought to be those of Artaxerxes II and III and Darius III are located at Persepolis. Each cross-shaped facade is over 75 feet high and 60 feet wide. The reliefs below the tombs were added in the 3rd century CE by Sasanian kings. Here, Darius I's crypt contains 3 chambers, each with 3 burial cists. When explored by the Oriental Institute in the 1930s, the tomb was empty, offering no clue as to who had been interred beside the great king. There's the tombs. A challenge for the restorers, recreating the fallen giants. We must not forget that monuments are like sick people. There is no treatment that is the right one for everybody. One and the same medicine cannot be administered to all patients alike, even if they are suffering from the same illness. Giuseppe Tucci, president of the Italian Institute of the Middle and Far East, or ISMIO, had chosen his analogy well. Invited by Iranian authorities in 1964 to conserve the royal city of Persepolis, the ISMIO crew, led by Giuseppe Tillia and Anbert Tillia, approached the task with the dedication and skill of a group of doctors. Beginning with the research of previous excavators, the husband and wife team undertook a campaign that would stabilize existing structures, re-erect fallen columns, put reliefs back in place, and repair damaged stairways. Tucci likened the team's efforts to a resurrection. The Tillias also drew on earlier investigations to confirm that color had decorated the structures. Studies done during the excavations of the 1930s and later by researchers on a relief fragment of the Fogg Art Museum in Massachusetts convinced the archaeologists that the buildings had indeed been highlighted with blue, green, yellow, and red pigments. In a book on their work, Anbretilia remarked that after soaking the relief section with water and by looking at it through a strong magnifying glass, we found the colors standing out brightly. The recreation here by Giuseppe Tillia hints at how Persepolis must have glowed under the intense rays of the Persian sun. You can see this picture is up here. That's what it had looked like. Caged in steel, a bull's head measuring more than 7 feet tall is guided into its original position in the portico of the Hall of 100 Columns at Persepolis. Here, workers replace missing pieces of a column with stone taken from the same quarries that Darius I used 2,500 years ago. Then, on a door frame of the council hall, a deity hovers protectively above the king, who is accompanied by attendants carrying a sunshade and a fly whisk. This lovely depiction of a Persian woman holding flowers is incised on a gem blue chalcedony. Her draped gown and free swinging braid add to the charm of the image. Less than 1 inch high, this stone was discovered in the ancient Greek city of Eretria, which Darius I destroyed in 490 BCE. Though rarely represented in reliefs on Achaemenid palaces and public structures, women are seen in smaller, more personal artistic renderings, such as this. We can see, adorned with masses of gold jewelry and surrounded by burial goods, the skeleton in this watercolor painted at Susa was discovered there in 1901. 2 gold coins found among the debris from the vaulted ceiling that litters the bottom of the coffin date the entombment to between 350 and 332 BCE. The body is assumed to be that of a woman because of the small bones and lack of weaponry in the burial. Left unfinished and damaged by nature, the tomb of Darius III sits forlorn and abandoned at Persepolis. In a poignant reminder of an ill-fated reign, the monument to the last Achaemenid monarch was not ready to receive him at his death, and the body was most likely interred in one of 2 other tombs built next to the terrace at Persepolis. In contrast to the splendid reliefs on the Achaemenid tombs at Nashki-Rustam, the two blocked out but uncarved Persian guards at right mark a sad ending to a once glorious empire. See here, they never finished it. He died very suddenly. A Persian noble sits sideways in a chariot pulled by 4 horses while the driver stands. The chariot is embossed with the image of the Egyptian god Bes. Only 4 inches long and crafted of solid gold, the piece was part of the ox's treasure found in the late 19th century in Afghanistan. But wheels are knobbed, perhaps as precaution taken by wheelwrights to prevent chariots from slipping and sliding. The Tribute of Empire. Darius I was a man to enjoy his triumphs and boast of them, and with good reason. Under this greatest of the Persian kings, an empire, the likes of which the world had never seen before, came into existence, with subject peoples from as far away as Egypt and India journeying to this capital of Persepolis to pay obeisance to him. I ruled over them, ran an inscription on his tomb. They bore tribute to me. What was said to them by me, that they did. At Persepolis, Darius commissioned a series of carved stone reliefs, completed under the rule of his son Xerxes I, that ran imposingly along the stairways of the Apadana, or audience hall. The reliefs portray different peoples who are a part of Darius's empire, each group identified by its native costume. Leading animals from their homelands, the tributaries, in a reverent, stately cadence, carry valuable indigenous raw materials, balls of thread, gold dust, ivory, and precious objects such as exquisitely wrought amphorae and armlets, all to be offered as tribute to the king. Some of the individuals and groups representing delegations at Persepolis form part of this essay. On the following pages, their silhouetted images are coupled with artifacts from the Achaemenid period. Although most of the objects shown were recovered in the far-flung reaches of the Persian Empire and sometimes beyond, they are typical of the kinds of gifts the tribute bearers would have presented to Darius. Exposure to the diverse styles and tastes of the realm was to influence artists of the Achaemenid period deeply. Indeed, the Persians eagerly took inspiration from the art and architecture of all the peoples they made subject, and in their willingness to combine foreign motifs with those of their own local tradition, the Persians managed to create an imperial style that would, in turn, have an effect on artisans throughout the continents of Europe and Asia, even long after the Achaemenids had disappeared. Let's see some of these artifacts. This gold bowl, which is similar to the one carried by a member of the Assyrian delegation, shown here, is embellished with handles in the shape of stretching lions, a common motif in Persian art. Presented to Tsar Peter the Great by the Russian governor of Siberia, it probably came from a remote Scythian tomb in that huge region. From a cemetery in Duvanli, Bulgaria, the silver amphora shown here closely resembles the two carried by the Lydian shown here. Rearing lions form the handles, one of which doubles as a spout. The beast on the right is missing the ibex horns that still grace the other. Amphorae like this would have been used for wine at banquets. Adorned with elegant wings, this 11-inch high ibex functioned as the handle of a drinking vessel. The silver and gold figure incorporates several stylistic elements. The position and rendering of the animal's body is Greek, while the mask on the base combines features of two gods, the Greek Silenus and the Phoenician Egyptian Bes. Wrought of gold and precious stones, the necklaces shown here, found in an Achaemenid period tomb in Susa, reiterate the Persians' love of adornment. Many of the materials used, such as the gold dust carried in bottles inside baskets by the Indians, shown here, were probably imported into the region. Earrings inlaid with turquoise and lapis lazuli are similar in design to this pair from Susa, were common during the Achaemenid period. They were worn by both men and women. The technique of inlaying, common throughout Middle Eastern cultures, may have been derived from the Egyptians. A milky white glass jar decorated with red and white eyes lay at Babylon in the grave of an Achaemenid period girl. Glass vessels were being manufactured in Mesopotamia as early as the mid-2nd millennium BCE, and several fragments of glassware discovered at Persepolis may be the remains of objects imported from there. Preserved in the frozen earth of Siberia for more than 2,000 years, this remnant of a horse's wooden breastband woven in Persia suggests the flow of Persian products during Achaemenid times. You can see here 2 Ionian tributaries at Persepolis carry cloth and balls of thread, perhaps silk or spun gold. Twin-winged lions with upraised paws and the ears of bulls enliven a gold ornament that may have been worn on a belt. Fantastic beasts, particularly snarling felines like these 2, are frequently seen in Persian art. The doubling here reflects the Persian predilection for symmetrical design. A 5th or 4th century BCE ivory sword pommel decorated with animal profiles echoes the bull's head capitals at Persepolis. Ivory, imported from Persia from Egypt, Nubia, and India, was a much valued raw material worked into a variety of decorative objects by Persian carvers. A silver raiton, the ubiquitous drinking horn of Persia, underscores the eclectic taste of the Achaemenids. The fanciful beast that forms its base is both mammal and bird. Its eagle head and wings, giant horns, bull ears, and lion legs have all been highlighted with gold. This gold scabbard from the Oxus treasure resembles those seen dangling at the sides of the Scythian tributaries and the Median cord below. You can see their belts. It is embossed with scenes of a royal hunt. The hunters wear Persian trousers, although their headgear echoes that worn by Assyrian kings. This gold armlet, one of the most spectacular pieces of jewelry from the Oxus treasure, terminates in griffins. Armlets were considered a prestige gift at the Persian courts, a custom obvious to the Scythian shown here, who carries 2 of them to present to the Persian king. Relic of the Sasanians, the last native dynasty to rule the Persian Empire. A carved rock wall near the royal city of Shipur honors 2 kings. Directly above the water channel, double rows of Shipur II stoic nobles are depicted. To the left, but only partially visible, is another relief showing the investiture of Bahram I. A roiling cloud of sand rushes toward the ruins of Dura, Europas, in this photograph taken along the western perimeter. The storm suggests how the ancient city, felled by the Sasanians in the 3rd century CE, came to lie hidden until the 1920s when excavations began. The stone walls of Dura, wrote American archaeologist Clark Hopkins, field director of excavations from 1931 to 1935, rose of the desert, like the bones of some long-lost half-submerged dinosaur buried 20 and 30 feet in desert sand. Worn steps ascend to the cult niche of Dura Europas's Mithraeum, temple of the Romanized god Mithras, long associated with the Persian deity of justice Mithra. Bas-reliefs of the god in Persian dress are surrounded by painted images, including 2 seated figures clasping scrolls and canes. The men are believed to be magi or priests. Roman soldiers who revered Mithras probably built this Mithraeum, as they did many others throughout their empire. We're going to talk about this in tomorrow's video, so we'll skip that part. I have a whole video on that little square. Workers push excavation carts down the center of Dura Europas's Market Street in the 1930s picture. Actually, 2 photos in perfectly spliced for a broader view. The streets shops whose ruins can be seen here were part of the Agora or marketplace built around 300 BCE by the Seleucids, then enlarged some 200 years later after the Parthians captured the city. Oh, look at this guy. Drinking cup in hand, club resting by his feet, a life-size Heracles lounges on a lion skin beside the Silk Road at Behistun. A protective canopy casts a shadow across a corner of the Seleucid rock carving, which has been dated 148 BCE by a Greek inscription found behind it. Excavators in the 1930s uncover a barrel vault tomb among the Parthian-level ruins of Seleucia on the Tigris, the Seleucid capital that first came under the Parthian influence in the 2nd century BCE. Parthian artifacts found here include the 2nd century CE marble woman reclining nude but for a necklace and a pair of sandals. A Hellenistic helmet protects the head of a warrior from Nisa, capital of the Parthian homeland, located near Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. Archaeologists discovered the 2nd century BCE painted clay head in a room not far from Nisa's monumental square hall in the 1980s. A powerful centaur leaps from the handle of an elephant tuscaryon, the ubiquitous drinking cup of the Persians, while a scene believed to portray a Dionysian rite plays out on the cup's rim. Shown here, a phrase from a second rite shown animals being led to sacrifice in another religious ceremony. Archaeologists restored 60 of these ivory rita, probably carved in Nisa or nearby, from pieces found in the square hall, where a wall had collapsed on the bench that held the cups. Bedecked in flowing gown, headdress, and jewels, a noblewoman of Hatra reflects Parthian fashions of the 2nd century CE. Archaeologists have gleaned knowledge about Parthian jewelry from statues such as this one, as well as from unearthed examples. Those pieces include a 3rd century CE earring from Hatra, shown here, made of gold and spinel, a ruby-like gem, and a 1st or 2nd CE golden pearl earring from Seleucia, inset with an oval garnet. Soaring yawns and majestic domes of the Parthians and Sasanians. Awed by the Tachikisra's enormity, long ago visitors to the beautiful powers of Ctesiphon swore it seemed the work of genies. The Sasanian structure with its towering vaults owed more to Parthian architects, however, than magical beings. In palaces, temples, and homes, Parthians erected wands, vaulted rooms with one open side that usually led to a courtyard. Builders could span such spaces without centering or supportive columns. Techniques included laying a vault and sloping half circles back to front using fast bonding mortar. Columns appear as decorative elements on the wands' stucco facades. Sasanians offered their own innovations, including the squinch. This small supportive structure bridged adjacent walls at the corner, allowing builders to crown a square room with a dome. Sasanian domes and wands reflected European Romanesque architecture. The 15-foot-high yuan of the Sasanian palace Tachikisra is seen here in the 1880s. Just before half the facade fell, Tachikisra resembles the Parthian palace of Assur, reconstructed here. On a mountaintop not far from modern-day Firuzabad, goats rest among the crumbling 3rd century CE ruins of Ardashir I's palace. The first Sasanian king built his palace with his iwans and domes near the city he called the glory of Ardashir. A jagged hole exposed the interior of the dome of the 3rd century CE fortified palace Akalchi Duktar daylight. The squinches seen on either side of the small arched niche photo center cupping the corners of the room may be the earliest example of the Sasanian device for setting a dome atop a square room. pieces of wire securing torso to legs, the 6-foot 4-inch bronze statue believed to portray a Parthian prince stands in the village of Malamir 6 months after its discovery in 1933 by villagers digging a foundation at nearby Shami. British archaeologist Sir Orphaned, alerted to the find, spent a week excavating at the site and uncovered the ruins of a Parthian shrine with a small brick altar. A lively trade in textiles. Not surprisingly, fragile cloth is one of the rarest survivals of the past. But in the case of Sasanian textiles, history has been lucky. Some 100 fragments exist today to give a glimpse of the once flourishing industry whose outposts traveled far and wide over the Silk Road linking Asia and Europe by trade. Significantly, almost all the samples that have come down to modern times were found not in the Sasanians' homeland, but in Europe, Central Asia, Chinese Turkestan, and Egypt. Many of the European pieces owe their preservation to their inclusion in church treasuries. Scholars even see the original fabric's rich and intricate designs as having influenced medieval art. One of the few examples of Persian cloth recovered on home ground, the women woven in wool right here, is thought to be from the Parthian period. There you go. Suggesting that sophisticated weaving predated Sasanian rule in Persia. To the local talent would have been added the know-how of the Romans. Historical sources indicate that King Shapur I forcibly set up Roman prisoners as weavers in the Persian province of Khuzestan after conquering northern Mesopotamia and Syria in the 3rd century BCE. The achievement of the Sasanians is conveyed by the silk fragment shown here, found in Egypt. It includes a beribboned ram, a typical Sasanian design. Having made a name for themselves in the ancient world, the weavers held onto their reputations into the 17th century CE. A Sasanian king, thought to be Khosrow II, slays a leaping wild boar from a boat. He's accompanied by a large entourage, including a second vessel filled with harp-playing musicians. This rock relief of a royal hunt appears in the Great Grotto at Takibustan and is rich in details from the pattern of the monarch's clothing to the swirling water and fish depicted just below him. Modern graffiti marred the masterpiece. Oh, these were the other ones. The harp-playing musicians. And this is the swirling water and fish. Two rock-cut Sasanian ossuaries sit among the desolate cliffs near Nashkiristam under a deep blue sky, forbidden by Zoroastrianism to pollute the earth by burying corpses. Sasanians exposed their dead to carrion birds on mountaintops. Then they placed the denuded bones in ossuaries. Cremation was forbidden as well because fire was sacred. Sasanian kings portrayed fire altars on the reverse side of silver coins minted during their reigns, as seen here on Bahram V's coins. A statue of Shapur I, carved from a stalactite, lies toppled by an earthquake in the cave near Bishapur, where it stood for centuries. The figure, originally more than 26 feet from ceiling to floor, was re-erected in the 1970s at the cave's entrance by restorers using cement and a substitute for missing parts, but the statue has since fallen again or been taken down. Treasures for the eye. Working with gold, silver, precious gems, and colored glass, Sasanian artisans created magnificent works of art. Under imperial mandate to exalt the king, they catered to a taste for the luxurious. To ensure royal satisfaction, Shapur II, thought to be the monarch shown here, established a system that divided artisans into specialty groups. In turn, these were overseen by his appointed chief, who directed their work, inspected craft shops throughout today's Iran, and apparently controlled raw materials. Metallurgic analyses of many royal vessels suggest the silver is from a single source. The artisans dazzled with their skills. They used gold sparingly, perhaps because of scarce native deposits, frequently as an enhancement. Able to solder separate molded pieces to the surfaces of objects for a raised three-dimensional effect, they often highlighted the additions with gold foil. This technique was richly employed in the production of so-called hunting blades, which show kings clothed in full regalia, engaging ferocious beasts in mortal combat. Sasanian monarchs would present such works to allies and neighboring rulers as reminders of their authority, valor, and prowess. Sasanian art influenced civilizations from the Far East to Europe, and objects of Sasanian manufacture traveled over long distances as gifts or items of trade and plunder, winding up thousands of miles from Persia. The widespread adoption of Sasanian motifs by other cultures, as well as the looting of objects by grave robbers, has hindered precise dating and attribution. What is certain, however, is that 13 centuries after the fall of the empire, its treasures continued to delight the eye. 2 rams dead beneath his horse's hooves. A king pursues a pair in flight on this 5th or 6th century silver plate. The figures in relief are separate pieces that were affixed to the background and enhanced by gilding and inlay. In this 3rd or 4th century CE Sardanic's cameo, a triumphant Shipur I, sword sheathed, grasps an army of Valerian, signaling the capture of the Roman emperor. This piece commemorates the Sasanian victory over the Romans in 260 CE. Down here, gold covers the scabbard and handle of this late Sasanian iron sword, which is also embellished with inlaid garnets and glass jewels. Artists almost always depicted the Sasanian king with a sword, a symbol of rank and authority. Volute-shaped reliefs characteristic of Sasanian glasswork decorate this delicate vessel, which is believed to be late Sasanian or early Islamic to date. Plant forms and crosshatch lines decorate the rock crystal base of this golden bowl. Discovered at Susa, the jewel-like vessel is probably of late Sasanian manufacture. This silver horse, probably created in the 3rd or early 4th century CE, served as a ceremonial rhyton. Its elaborate forelock is the funnel, and an opening in its chest is the spout. The artisan used gold foil as an enhancement. A male bird surrounded by a halo and wearing a necklace with oval pendants graces the 7th century silver gilt vase. In Sasanian art, such halos and necklaces are often associated with the king. Semi-precious stones, called hyacinths by the ancients, still glow in their gold setting in this 3rd or 4th century CE belt pendant, thought to be of Sasanian origin, found in Wolfsheim, Germany in 1870. A Persian inscription gives the owner's name as Ardashir. Pouring liquid into the mouth of a tiny panther and holding a flower, a woman undulates on this silver-gilt ewer. 3 similar dancers grace its other sides. Such quartets were among the most popular of late Sasanian motifs. A glittering rainbow of glass inlays encircles the rock crystal center of this gold bowl, where a king, legs jutting in a typical Sasanian pose, is enthroned. Legend says it came to the Abbey of Saint-Denis in Paris as a gift from 9th century Holy Roman Emperor Charles the Bald. And I'll skip this part because this video